Well, thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today. I really appreciate it. We're trying to do this and touch base with a couple different doctors and just get some of the latest research and just out there, and also give some in our community a chance to get to know some of the doctors a little bit better that have been involved in working with people with Noonan syndrome and also doing some research along those lines. So again, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
And thanks for inviting me. It's always fun to do these sort of interactive sessions, and hopefully it can be helpful to the community out there.
Yeah, that's our hope as well. So first, I just wanted to kind of dig in, talk about your background a little bit. What's your specialty? What do you do? Where do you work? Tell us a little bit about all that.
Sure, happy to do that. So I am a pediatric cardiologist by training, and I'm sure with your audience that needs no explanation. During my training, which I did in Houston, Texas, at Texas Children's Hospital, I took what I referred to as a wrong turn, whereas most people were really interested, most of the trainees were interested in figuring out how to provide better care to children who had heart problems, which is certainly a pretty wonderful thing to do. I got interested in the question of why children were born with heart problems in the first place. And especially back then, but it's even true to this day, to a large extent, we really didn't know very much at all. We knew a few simple things, like, for instance, that children who are born with Down syndrome tend to have heart problems. We knew a few simple things like that, but that was about it. And it happened to be a moment in time when it became possible to use genetic technology, which was booming, to start to figure out what changes in genes were leading to what genetic disorders. So that's what I got interested in, and I got training in while I was in Houston. And when I finished my training, I moved back to New York. I'm from the New York area. And I was fortunate enough to get a job at what was then called the Mount Sinai School of Medicine. Now it's called the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. And it was with the intent of doing genetic research, and that's what I've done. And at the very beginning, we had to limit what we studied to the kinds of traits that are inherited the way Noonan syndrome is when it's in a family, which is, it's passed along from generation to generation. Nowadays, we can study other kinds of genetic diseases that are way more complicated, but back then you really couldn't. And there isn't that much of congenital heart disease that pops up in that way. I guess that's a good thing. Most kids, it just pops out of nowhere. It's not usually running in the family. And so if it wasn't running in the family, there was no easy way to find it. And then I studied a different disorder. We were fortunate, we found the gene, and I went to another medical school in the New York City area and gave a talk about that discovery. And while I was there, one of the people there said to me, "Hey, we have DNAs from a few families with Noonan syndrome. Maybe you'd be interested in taking a look at that." And of course, being a pediatric cardiologist, I knew about Noonan syndrome. I knew like a slender fraction of what I guess I've come to learn or know today, but I knew enough to know what it was, and I knew it was important. And so I sort of tried not to drool too much and said, yes, I'd love to do that. And eventually they gave me those DNAs and we went on to study them. And I was blessed with an incredible, smart trainee then named Marco Tartaglia. And between the two of us, we quickly figured out the first gene for Noonan syndrome, which was PTPN11, of course. And that was 20 years ago. And ever since, I've pretty much, got up every morning and been thinking about Noonan syndrome.
Very interesting. So do you have any recent research with regard to Noonan syndrome to discuss or to share with us?
Well, sure. I mean, in general, there are a number of things going on in Noonan syndrome. I would say that the efforts to find the genes for Noonan syndrome is kind of coming to an end. We have a good long list at this point. We can't yet explain every case where the docs are thinking that it's Noonan syndrome, but We can explain most of them. Genetic testing is quite good. It probably picks up, I don't know, 85% of the cases. So my own group is not doing a lot in that area at this point. And so we're focusing our efforts on two other areas. One is trying to understand, okay, we know now the names of the genes and we know what the changes in the genes are that cause Noonan syndrome, but how exactly do you get from that to the actual problems that patients with Noonan syndrome struggle with? And related question to that, because it turns out that most of them are sort of playing in the same biological sandbox and tending to have seemingly similar effects. And yet we know that kids with changes in different genes have relatively different flavors of Noonan syndrome. Just to give an example, the kids with RAF1 or RIT1 defects almost always have hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. That's where the heart muscle is too thick and all that. Whereas the children with PTPN11, it's really a small fraction of those kids that will have that. And why is that? We think they're all changing biology in kind of similar ways. And so where does that specificity come from? So we don't know, and we're interested in figuring that out, partially because we just want to know, and partially because we think if we understood the mechanics a little better, maybe we could get around to actually coming up with better therapeutic approaches for kids with Noonan syndrome. So that's one broad area, and I can talk more about that if you wish. The second broad area is to try and develop new therapies. So I know that the Noonie community is very excited about what's happening with therapies, and most of the work being done right now has to do with finding medicines, drugs that'll work to help the kids. And right now, the things that are being used are mostly restricted to kids who are really in trouble. So that's mostly the babies with the very severe form of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. There's also been a little bit of use for kids who have this intractable form where they have leaking of fluid, what's called lymphatic fluid, and they get swelling or accumulations around the lungs, that sort of stuff. So we've tried some very powerful medicines. They come out of the cancer world, and they come out of the cancer world because there's biological overlap between some cancers and Noonan syndrome in terms of how biology has changed. And it looks like those things might work, and the community is gearing up to the moment where we're going to have proper clinical trials, and we're not there yet, but I'm limited in what I can say, but I'll just say we're driving in that direction. In the meantime, though, it's already apparent that those medicines, first of all, they are very strong, so there are some potential side effect issues, number one. And number two, even if you leave side effects out, they don't look like they work for all situations and all kids. Maybe that's based on the gene change. We just don't know yet. So we're probably going to need more than one drug. Not so unusual. Many medical conditions, we need more than one medicine in the armamentarium to help people. And so the question is, what else could we use? So my group has been really, I think, working hard on that question. And we're taking two different approaches. One is to say, okay, are there drugs on the shelf that we can pull off and redirect instead of using them the way they were originally intended? Can we use them for Noonan syndrome? That's very attractive because if you have a medicine that, let's say, the FDA has already approved, and then you can show it works for Noonan syndrome, the path to actually being able to get it into kids and help them is much shorter than anything else you can do, because the alternative, which we're also working with, is come up with brand new medicines. That sounds super exciting, and frankly, I'm very excited about it. But the path from there to actually giving it to a person, knowing what the right dose is and knowing, that it's safe for them, that's a long path and very expensive too. And so that's a lot trickier to navigate. And, that's like a decade to do that. So we are pursuing all of that. And that's work that we're involved with as well.
Yeah, and I was actually, as you were talking about that, I was curious a little bit what that process looks like. Who are the parties that are involved? Where does the money come from? Talking about developing new drugs, if you could speak a little bit more to that process.
Sure. Well, let's start with how do we get drug companies interested in the drugs we know about? So far for Noonan syndrome, the class of medication that's been used is called a MEK inhibitor. There's one in particular called trametinib, which has been used. I was on the paper. Gregor Andelfinger in Montreal and a physician in Germany tried it in 2 little babies successfully. So we've written that up. And then since then, babies in the US, Europe, Canada, who are real sick have been getting that medicine. And, so far we're doing it all on a compassionate usage basis or off-label basis, depending on exactly how we do it. And that's good. And obviously, if heaven forbid you're the parent of a child who's that sick, nobody wants to be in that situation. That's potentially life-saving. That's like a miracle. But we're not really learning anything in the sense that we don't know the right doses. We're not doing it the way we do in a clinical trial to prove that it works. And until we prove that it works, insurance companies are not likely to ever pay for it because you got to get proof. And we'll never get to the point that it has an FDA label to say that this is actually something that's works and is safe and we can do for kids, and here's how we do it. So for that, we need a drug company because really they're the ones that tend to own the drugs. They're the ones that have the resources to do it. Theoretically, you could try applying for grants to the National Institutes of Health, but it's very tough. And in Noonan syndrome, it's dramatically tough because not only do we have those very sick babies, but let's say it works for that. There are a lot of other things, hypothetically, we'd like to try treating in Noonan syndrome. I'll just give you one example. When we treated those 2 babies, we've already written this up, so it's out there in the public forum already. Both of those babies had not just hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, but they had bad valve narrowing of the pulmonary valve stenosis. And that got better on medicine. So that's a pretty cool concept, right? So you can imagine that maybe someday if we knew the drug was safe enough, rather than sending kids off to the cath lab or worse to the operating room, maybe we could give them, medicine and make them better. But that requires another drug trial and more money. And so really you got to have companies that are in it. So right now the discussions are happening with companies. Fortunately, this class of medicine, so far there's I think only 2 or 3 that are FDA approved in the US. The companies that have those approved do not want to do trials for Noonan at this time. That's their position on that. And so we're looking for other companies, and they exist, who are interested in MEK inhibitors. There are other MEK inhibitors, and we're just working our way through that. And then there's I know of at least one other company with a different kind of drug that I think is looking to start up a drug trial as well, and we'll see what happens with that. So I think that's one clear path. But you asked, how about new drugs? So there are 2 ways that new drugs could happen. One is that drug company or a startup pharmaceutical biotech company decides to do research on this and find something. That is possible, but unlikely. And that's because they tend to go for things that are going to have a huge return on investment. The costs are high, the uncertainty is high. And so they find, for instance, working on adult cancers really attractive because there's so many of them. There aren't so many patients with Noonan syndrome, certainly not if you're even down to just some parts of Noonan syndrome. That's too rare for them. So they're not so interested in that. They tend not to go after that. The government has incentivized them, so it does happen some. I'm not going to say not at all, but tends not to be where they dig in. So then you're dependent on people in academia, like myself, where we can use resources we get from the government through the National Institutes of Health to try and get things started. In my case, we also had a $1 million bike ride grant that helped somewhat at the beginning. And the reason that we can do that is we don't have the same problem with risk, right? Like if a drug company fails and they don't come up with a drug, they've got nothing. If I'm working on it and I have grants and I'm publishing papers, I'm still academically successful, even if I don't come up with a drug. Obviously, I'd rather come up with a drug, but I can still get away with it without going out of business. That's not true of a startup company. If this is their drug and it fails, then they're out of business. So the idea is to get it far enough along in academia that it gets interesting for the company. So basically, you've taken enough of the risk away because you've
Okay.
already gotten it far enough along. Maybe you've already given it to mice, for instance. There are mouse models of Noonan syndrome. Maybe we've given it to a mouse and it works. And then if I go to one of these small companies, not a big company, but a small company, and say, hey, I've got this thing, I gave it to mice, it made it better, I need somebody to take it from here and do all that's needed to show that it's safe and effective for patients, that's much more attractive because their risk profile is much better at that point. And so that's what we're skating for. But for sure, like Mount Sinai is not going to take it all the way from discovery to, all the way to a trial. At some point, it has to go to industry. It should. They're good at that. That's what they do well.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. So is there a role for the Noonan community to play in that process? Is there something that we should or could be doing to help advocate for new drugs, or raise funds for it or anything like
Yeah.
that?
So I do think there are a couple pieces. One is, there is the $1 million bike ride stuff that raises money, and like I said, we got one of those grants, and that helped us get going a little bit. So that's good. More of that is good, and those grants, however, are really fairly small, and they don't take you very far. There are organizations for other disorders that are bigger that, look at how much money has been raised for neurofibromatosis, for instance. They've been able to enable more research with monies raised, but you need to get into big dollars to do that. So that's a challenge, but some groups succeed with that. The other piece that I think is important is the advocacy piece. And I know, for instance, the Rasopathy Net people have been doing a bit of that, interacting with other groups, talking to congressmen and women, et cetera. I think that's important because, they do listen, they do respond to advocacy from families that are affected. They're obviously not going to listen so much to people from companies because they think they're just self-interested. And even from somebody like me, there's a degree of self-interest there from the point of view of the lawmakers. And so I do think the unique position that families are in and family groups are in is that they can advocate, they're advocating for their kids and their kids' struggles. And that is something that is listened to. You guys are seen as obviously neutral arbiters. Obviously you care, you're biased in the fact that you have kids, but you don't have a financial interest. You're not conflicted that way. And they listen to that. So I think there's a role for that, and making sure that the powers that be, including say the FDA, are aware that there's interest in the community, that this is important in the community. And you could just, well, to take an example, I mean, depending on how old people are or what they've read about, there was a tremendous amount of advocacy around AIDS to make sure the FDA understood that there was a pressing need here. We couldn't dilly-dally. People are dying. Let's get this going, cut through the red tape and get it moving. So maybe we need something like that at a certain point for Noonan too, to understand that those young babies without medicine, with the severe form of heart disease, they're mostly dying, before they get to 1, and we don't have good answers for them. So sometimes helping them understand the urgency is something that uniquely families can do.
I did have a question that was submitted from someone in our community that I wanted to read, and maybe you can help me explain some of these acronyms too that are in here, because I'm not sure exactly what
Sure.
what all this is talking about. But any updates on how children are doing on the Mtor inhibitor everolimus? Have any of the children experienced reversal of HCM? Any other options for children with Noonan, with NSML and severe HCM?
Right. So what the questioner is asking about is not relevant to Noonan syndrome. Let me just say first, so that's clear. It's really only, as far as we understand, only relevant for children, potentially relevant for children who have Noonan syndrome with multiple antigenies, which used to be called leopard syndrome. People may come across that name, but we've pretty much changed it to Noonan syndrome with multiple antigenies. And because that's a really long name and days are short, we'll go with NSML. So for kids with NSML. And so even though the kids with NSML almost invariably have changes in PTPN11, which of course changes in PTPN11 account for about half of Noonan syndrome, the actual changes are different between Noonan and NSML, and they work biologically somewhat differently. They activate different pathways. So Noonan syndrome, the pathway is called the RAS-MAP kinase pathway, and so the drug we've been trying in kids that we've already published, which is trametinib, is a blocker of that pathway. Whereas in NSML, it's activating a different pathway called the Mtor pathway. That's what you read. And there are fortunately already Mtor inhibitors around. They're used for different things, but they're particularly used to suppress the immune system for patients who have had organ transplants. So the experience so far with Mtor inhibitors, everolimus is one of them, for NSML is, as far as I know, very limited. I was on a paper where we used it in one baby in Germany who was sick with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy who had NSML. The child seemed to stabilize, and then like a few weeks later, before we got too deep into it, a heart became available, and that baby had a heart transplant and then did well after that. So I don't think it was intriguing, but hardly definitive that it works for those babies. I haven't seen other papers yet, and maybe I'm missing something because things come out all the time, but I haven't seen anything else on mTOR inhibitors for NSML that's published. I know of some data that's unpublished, and I'm on a paper where we have a little piece that includes some of that, and we have that in review. I can't talk about that because it's in peer review, but hopefully we'll be able to get that information out within 6 months or a year. But again, it's worse than Noonan because NSML is rarer. We really need a trial to prove that it works or it doesn't work, and that is not such an active area right now because NSML is, it's 10, 50 times less common than Noonan syndrome. So it's hard to get the numbers to do a clinical trial, and it's hard to get anybody interested because the market for it is so small.
Okay. Thank you for explaining that. Another question from someone in our community. There was some news reports about teenage boys having some sort of cardiac event after receiving the COVID vaccine. Any concerns from a cardiology standpoint for children or individuals with Noonan syndrome to get the vaccine or to get the booster shots?
Right. So I'll give the short answer and then I'll give the really long answer. So the short answer is no, I'm not concerned about that. Now comes the much longer answer, which is basically explain what the person is getting at and where my answer comes from. So one of the things we learned when teenagers and young adults were getting the vaccines was that a very small number of them were developing, typically after the second shot for Moderna or Pfizer, they were developing inflammation of the muscle in the heart. And that problem is called myocarditis. Myocardium refers to heart muscle, and itis, as usual, refers to inflammation. Pretty rare. Overall, almost none in females, almost only in males. The rate was, I think, on the order of about 20 cases out of 1 million people vaccinated. So that's a really tiny number. Still, of course, sounds very scary. The reason I'll try and convince people that it isn't what it seems at first blush is twofold. One, for the people that have gotten it, it's been mild and what we call self-limited, meaning they get all better within just a few weeks. And nobody's gone to heart transplant. Nobody in the U.S. has died from this. So it's not a great thing. But the real reason we think that is not such a great cause for concern is because of what's on the other side of the equation, which is the risk of getting the disease because you don't take the vaccine. So it turns out that kids who don't, who get full-on COVID are at risk, particularly for this hyperimmune, hyperinflammatory condition, which pops up about a month after they have the virus. We call it MIS-C, which I'm going to get it wrong. I think it's multi-system inflammatory syndrome of childhood or something like that, MIS-C. And it's wicked. And they come in sick as can be, including with very bad myocarditis. And there, some of the kids, the heart hasn't been working well at all, and some of them have died from that disease. So, and the rates are such that if you do the numbers, your overall risk of getting the bad COVID is worse than your rate of getting myocarditis after vaccine. So bottom line is the risk of not getting the vaccine outstrips the risk of the vaccine. So that's why it's worth taking that little bit of risk, is how we see it. Another thing I'll add, and this is now into the realm of the unknown, because people will know that in the United States, we only just got the approval for the Pfizer for kids down to age 5, right? Ages 5 to 11. Our expectations, so now I'm doing a prediction, so take it with that grain of salt, is that, first of all, again, we'll see, if we see it, it's going to be more in boys than girls, because that's how myocarditis rolls. And number two, it will be at a lower rate, even less frequent or even more rare than it is in the teenagers. And that's because if you look at myocarditis as a problem in general, because you get myocarditis after many viruses, it's commoner in teenagers and young adults than it is in little kids. You know, little kids have different immune system than teenagers. So why this is exactly, we don't know, but it's true. We expect that to hold up with the vaccine-related myocarditis too. So if that's true, it'll be less frequent in those younger kids. And so that would be a wonderful thing for that age group. Time will tell. We don't know about myocarditis in teenagers or younger kids due to the booster, because so far we haven't gotten there. To my knowledge, we're doing boosters in the US, some other countries like Israel are, other countries like in Europe, not so much. Nobody has yet been giving boosters to teenagers or younger kids, so time will tell. But I don't see any reason to think it's going to be worse than what we saw after the second vaccine. If anything, I would predict less. So on balance, again, what we're talking about here is risk for your kids. And I think the risk is just worse from the disease itself than from the vaccine. And then the last thing I'll say is that at the present time, we don't have any Noonan specific information, right? We have no reason to think that kids with Noonan are any more or less susceptible to being sick with COVID, getting myocarditis after vaccine, whatever. We have no reason to believe that. For the most part, they respond to everything else from a point of view infections and vaccines like all other kids. So I don't know why this would be different, but we don't have data to answer that.
Okay. One last question for parents of kids with Noonan that have cardiology concerns. What advice would you give to them, or what resources would you point them to? If they've got questions or concerns about what's going on in that area of cardiology.
Sure. So what I would tell people, because this comes up a lot, like in the summer meetings, people ask about this sort of thing all the time. And I think my lead message is this. The truth is that for most of the problems of the heart in Noonan syndrome, what we do for the child is based on the heart problem itself and not on the fact that the child has Noonan syndrome. So let's take the commonest problem, which is pulmonary valve stenosis. Pediatric cardiologists know how to deal with pulmonary valve stenosis. That's true, at the biggest academic medical centers. It's true in smaller places, in more remote locations. And so I think for the most part, the pediatric cardiologist you're seeing is going to know how to handle the problem. I think there are some niche things that maybe would elude them. What would those be? One is that in kids with Noonan, when they have valve problems, sometimes they get worse even beyond when they're little kids. Generally, our rules are like if pulmonary valve stenosis isn't too bad by about age 5, you can pretty well go to the bank for most kids that's it. Noonan syndrome, it can still progress after that, so you got to watch a little more than you might otherwise. I mean, nobody's going to send them away anyway, but you just got to know that. And then the other thing is, like with the severe hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, that's super rare. And I wouldn't expect the typical pediatric cardiologist to know that we're trying trametinib. So that's where being plugged into the, the Noonan Syndrome Foundation and the Facebook group and so on to ask for help if you're really in a tough spot. And then they wind up turning to people like myself who think about Noonan. We have people in GI and neuro, whatever, who can help you if there's something that's a little more unusual going on.
Okay. Well, again, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it, and I know that our community does as well. And anything else to add? Anything else to plug or closing
Well, the
remarks?
one thing I'll say is the rumor is we'll be having a meeting next summer, and I just hope that A, we can, and B, that people who are within shooting range of where we're going to be can make it. I think it'll be. I don't know about everybody else, but I miss getting together. It's really, we always learn from one another, and it's usually a very positive experience. So I hope that happens, and I hope people are able to get there. It'd be great to see people again.
Yeah, we are planning towards that at this point for July in DC. So we'll have more details to come soon for our community for registering and all that. And we will be coordinating with you and other doctors on that as well. So look forward to that as well. So, yeah, fingers crossed. Exactly. Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Gelb. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me on, Corey. Good luck to you. Take care. Bye now.
Bye.